Hello, Professor Brian Lucey.
Hi.
Many thanks for your time here at Corvinus University of Budapest. From Sustainable Finance Research Center, we are very interested in to know more about your expertise in finance, and also nowadays that you are also studying biodiversity.
Yeah,
So I will start with the first question. So
sure.
what do you think about biodiversity and finance? Why is now more important to know about biodiversity in financial discussion?
I think we have a classic situation where everybody knew, yeah, probably nature is important and biodiversity as part of nature is important. But until recently, the biodiversity and finance area tended to be about how do we best design instruments for a company that wants to float a bond to do a nature positive business venture, or biodiversity credits to try and encourage actors, companies, funds to act, you know, tread lightly upon nature. And that's great, and there's a long research tradition. Only recently have we kind of flipped it over a little bit, and have we begun to use data, primarily that comes from natural language processing, to try and say, well, can we measure how exposed companies are, how exposed assets more generally are to potential biodiversity loss. So it's a classic case of where the data become available, and yes, they absolutely illuminate. We can now see stuff, but they also show shadows. You know, a light doesn't just throw light, it throws shadows. So now we see a lot more areas we go like, gee, we really should look at that. So I think it's a case of serendipity, that the data became available, or data sources became available, and that has sparked a significant growth in the issue of biodiversity and finance. Because ultimately, even companies that are not directly exposed, telecoms companies, retail companies, to nature, are absolutely exposed through their supply chain somewhere along the way. End of the day, humans are part of the biosphere. If we wreck the biosphere, then there's not going to be an economy. You know, the distance to default of a bank is going to be the least of our problems if, you know, we have nothing left to eat. So the availability of data has allowed for research to move to where, you know, it probably should have been a while ago.
That's very interesting. And also, there is another question that I have. So we have also as well biodiversity exposure
Yep.
and risk, right?
Yep.
So how can we understand this with finance, biodiversity exposure and risk? How can people can understand better these concepts?
So everybody's exposed. Every company, every asset is exposed to biodiversity issues. As I say, even if you are, you know, not immediately exposed, you are exposed through your supply chain. Biodiversity risk is a kind of a portmanteau term that we have used, which basically is trying to get at something that's inherently difficult to, it's not difficult to conceptualize, but it's difficult to measure, which is, to what extent is the company's bottom line liable to be impacted by biodiversity changes? That's a big mouthful, but so biodiversity risk is what we tend to use. And the reason, I suppose, is it is clear from the research that has come out over the last 3 or 4 years that biodiversity risk is priced. It is a material issue for companies. All companies are exposed. Some are very exposed. It is something that is different to climate risk. It is something that has the potential, and central banks and financial regulators are aware that it has the potential to be yet another systemic risk factor. So those who are active in the finance literature, research, action, supervision are now aware of this at a higher level, and are aware of the importance of this, not just as a, oh yes, and also biodiversity, but as a first frontline feature.
That's great. Maybe we can talk about some practical aspects of biodiversity risk management,
Mm-hmm.
like how companies or authorities within the European Union can say, okay, we are following biodiversity and we are trying to track this. How can these entities do this in practice, in the real life?
So it's difficult because what you have is you have a web, you have, a incoherent, diffuse web where each individual element of the company's supply chain or customer base may not have an individual major impact or a major element, but together they have. So what you don't want is we've had evidence when regulators have put in place quite strict regulations around things that companies will find ways around it. That's why you need to, I think, educate rather than regulate is the first thing. Second thing is you need to encourage the market. I'm no great fan of late stage capitalism, but it's the best system we have discovered, even though it's horrible. It's the best system we've discovered for translating wealth across. So if you can align the needs of nature and the desires of capitalistic enterprises, if you can get them moving in the same direction, it's a hugely powerful way to assist nature along the way. There is evidence that companies which are biopositive tend to have higher returns. It's a good thing to invest in them. If we can get that message out to say, hey, look, you don't have to just invest in evil corp, you could invest in nice corp and just do as well. Money will flow. It's about education rather than regulation.
Oh, that's very interesting then. So also in NATUREFIN, that is a project for that is being executed by Sustainable Finance Research Center. We have local businesses in Spain, Portugal, Finland, Greece, Hungary as well, and Albania, and also the regional and local authorities. So people that work in these policy instruments to improve the regions and locations. So what could be a great message to tell them to consider into this biodiversity management and also with our financial landscape that nowadays is more important, especially in Europe? Message for them?
So two things. One is there is a huge critical lack of research on small and medium enterprises and how they are exposed, the nature of how they're exposed, the extent of how they're exposed to biodiversity and more generally nature-related issues. That research gap urgently needs to be filled. Some people here in Corvinus are already working on that, and there are initiatives more generally around that are trying to fill these gaps. But on the assumption that they are exposed, then I think the question for regional and local and national governments is, what can we do, knowing that these companies are likely to be exposed, what can we do such that we reduce biodiversity degradation, and by carrying through from what we think we know about larger companies, this will benefit smaller companies. But that is usually costly because nature restoration, nature preservation costs money. So we need to basically sell the argument. Individually, individual companies will be perfectly willing to say, yes, of course we should have better nature. Collectively, nobody wants to take that bullet to say, yeah, we might need an extra tax or we might need to restrict this kind of activity. So again, it's back to education, I think. Back to education so that we can sell to the small business owners, we can sell to the small business regulators, that both can work together.
That's nice. So final question that I have for you today is, I heard that you mentioned about the late stage capitalism. So I am very curious about this. Who should push for biodiversity considerations into finance? Private companies, regulators, citizens, NGOs? Who has to push this forward?
I think it's incumbent on all of us. We're all investors through a pension fund or through savings products in banks. We can ask the questions. It's incumbent on individual citizens to do that, to put pressure. We know that these pressures, although small, do work in other areas. Companies are not unaware of consumer preference. I think we also need to put pressure on our politicians to say it's important. And it's not just important from a, everybody go and hug a tree. It's also important from the perspective of growing the economy. We can do both. It is one of those situations where it is win-win. It's just a matter of getting that message across to people that protecting nature is about protecting the economy. And there's no reason why the two can't go hand in hand.
That is nice. That is a good message. Protecting nature is protecting the economy as
well. Yeah.
That is just great to hear. So many thanks, Professor
Not
Brian
at all.
for your time.
Not at all.
So, many thanks for the interview.
Very happy.
Many thanks.